Warnings show up just about anywhere, not just on sun visors and washing machines, but even at church. In fact, maybe it feels like we're warned about more things at church than anywhere else. We've heard warnings against all kinds of activities and choices, and for the most part, they boil down to one word: sin. Just hearing the word brings negative vibes, right? Whether you've been coming to church for as long as you can remember, or if this is your first time here, the idea of sin is probably familiar. We understand that sin is something bad that we should avoid. But isn't it also true that when it comes to sin, we tend to think of it as a sliding scale? Here's what I mean. When we think of sin, we think of it as bad, but surely some sins are worse than others. Of course, we couldn't be disrespectful to our mom. That's way better than murder. We probably don't need to tell a lie. At least we're not stealing from people. We know that we shouldn't cheat on a quiz, but it's not as big of a deal as beating someone up. And eventually that leads to this question: does all sin matter? Are they all the same? Is it possible that we're overreacting about sin that doesn't seem like that big of a deal? How much damage do these smaller sins really do, especially if they aren't hurting anyone? When it comes to copying someone else's homework, breaking curfew, or telling a small lie, it seems harmless. So it definitely shouldn't be taken as seriously, right? Well, to answer these questions, we're going to go back to the book of Galatians, where we've spent the last couple of weeks just to recap on that book. It's a letter that the Apostle Paul, the most famous missionary who ever lived, wrote to a church of new followers of Jesus. To best understand what Paul is saying and why, it's important to know that Christianity was a new thing. People were just hearing about this Jesus guy for the first time. And when they had heard the story of his life, death, and coming back to life, people were hooked. Jesus came to show people a picture of God. After all, he was God. He talked about God's kingdom coming to earth, not with force or violence, but with love, mercy, and compassion. People were seeing God in a way that they had never seen him before, and it really caught their attention. This was something that they wanted to be a part of. But of course, this all came with questions. Everybody was trying to figure out just what following Jesus should look like in their world. Particularly, they wanted to know what they had to do and what they did not need to do. Basically, they wanted to know about the sin sliding scale. When it came to sin, what was a big deal and what wasn't? Well, Paul answers that question by writing this: "You will always harvest what you plant. Those who live only to satisfy their own sinful nature will harvest decay and death from that sinful nature. But those who live to please the Spirit will harvest everlasting life from the Spirit. So let's not get tired of doing what is good, and just the right time we will reap the harvest of blessing if we don't give up." You may wonder what this had to do with the question. Well, at the time that these people lived in was an agricultural time. The economy revolved around what was planted, grown, and then sold. So this audience, it made sense to them. When it comes to farming, you reap what you sow. If you plant corn, you're gonna get corn. If you plant, what you plant now determines what you'll harvest later. So when Paul compared these choices and outcomes to planting and harvesting, his audience understood exactly what he was saying. Paul was telling them that your choices will now determine what you will eventually harvest. What's true for crops is true for our lives. To put it another way, your decisions will someday bear fruit or have consequences. It may not happen tomorrow, but every choice and action is planting seeds for your future. Paul is asking, if you will one day harvest what you've planted, what does that look like? And instead of giving the Galatians a simple list of what sins to avoid and what sins can be taken a little less seriously, Paul tells the Galatians this: "Those who live only to satisfy their own sinful nature will harvest decay and death from that sinful nature." I know that that's really strong language, but Paul feels strongly about what he's telling these people. And Paul loved these people very much. He's telling them that bad choices lead to bad outcomes. It's just how life works. So while it may seem like Paul isn't answering a question that we aren't asking, the truth is he's getting right to the heart of the matter. If we're wondering what sin matters more than others, he's telling us that's the wrong question. We should be asking, what do we want to harvest? Because every decision has a harvest. It never just stands alone with no consequences. There's always an effect. So maybe you don't consider gossip that big of a deal. But if you continually plant gossip, you will eventually get the results of that gossip. You may ruin a friendship this year, or maybe the harvest will happen sometime in the future. Maybe someone will carry the hurtful words that you said about them for years to come. Or if you continually choose to not study, then cheat to pass a test, you may not have the foundation that you need when you go to college. Or if you continue to tell lies, people might not trust you in the future. If you continue to use drugs, alcohol, or sex to cope, you may harvest addiction, longer-term effects on your body, or just an inability to deal with stuff that life throws at you. When we change the question from, what can I get away with, to what do we want to harvest, it changes everything. If that sounds depressing, just hang on a minute. If you're planting good decisions, you're gonna experience a harvest of life. If you're planting the stuff that gives life, the stuff that Jesus talks about like joy, peace, rest, compassion, you'll grow those things. They'll take root in your life. Here's a good way to put it. Jesus said it like this: my purpose is to give them a rich and satisfying life. Some translators use the word abundant or full here instead of rich. Imagine abundant or full harvest of things like peace, joy, or even satisfaction. These things can really produce a wonderful life. I'd love for us to start asking the questions, what seeds do I want to plant? What kind of things do I want to grow? Let's let that be the filter that we use to make decisions. For some of us, we've spent a big part of our lives asking the wrong questions. And I get it. It's a lot easier to just know if we can do something or not, or how bad something is, like really. But asking the wrong questions can lead us to harvesting the wrong things. And we don't want to end up somewhere years down the road wondering, how did I get here? If we use our freedom to ask, is this helpful? Is this kind? Is this a way to an abundant life that Jesus talked about? We're more likely gonna end up where we wanna be, growing what we wanna grow, because this is true for all of us. So, how do you use your freedom now determines how much freedom you'll have later. Do you want your parents to give you more freedom later? Then plant trust, respect, and honor right now. Do you want healthy friendships? Then plant kindness, honesty, and compassion. Do you want freedom with money? Then plant patience, self-control, and wisdom right now.
Think about it this way. Paul talked about harvesting what you plant, which is an agricultural example. In high school, you can choose to make decisions that build the trust you have with people, like your parents or teachers. Every time you make those decisions, it's like planting a little bit of trust, like this. Or you can choose to use your treasure or money in ways now that plant seeds of generosity or financial responsibility, like this. Or you can use your talents in ways now that plant seeds of hard work and humility, whether that's sports or music or anything else. Or you can use your time now in ways that plant seeds of good habits and responsibility, like this. The way you use the freedom you have now when it comes to things like trust, treasure, talent, and time, plant seeds for what these areas of your life look like in the future, whether that's in a year, 5 years, or 50 years. The way you plant seeds now will determine the amount of things like trust with adults, financial freedom, work ethic, and responsibility you can have in the future. This is the way freedom works. How you use it now determines how much of it you have later.
Sometimes it can be hard to figure out just what we really want to harvest long term. That's why our small groups are so important. It's a chance to talk through some of these big questions with people going after the same thing with a leader who can help you. So when you make it to small group, be thinking through how you can encourage each other to plant seeds today that lead to more freedom in the future.